Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Book of Psalms. Today we're going to be looking at Psalms 60 through 62, and these are going to be, again, Psalms from David. So, getting right into it, Psalm 60 is the last of what are known as the Miktam Psalms. I don't know if that's exactly how you pronounce it, but okay. And describes the time when David was victorious over his enemies, the Edomites. The Edomites were soundly defeated, and they never rallied after it. Prophetically, it is the picture of the deliverance that God will give to his people, the remnant of Israel, after the suffering of the Great Tribulation. Verse 1 says, O God, thou hast cast off, thou hast scattered us, thou hast been displeased. O turn thyself to us now again. And then God answers in verse 6, God hath spoken in his holiness, I will rejoice, I will divide Shechem and mete out the valley of Succoth. And how will it be accomplished? We see that in verse 9 when he says, who will bring me into the strong or the fortified city? And that is the question. And then the answer is in verse 10 when it says, will not thou, O God, which hast cast us off, and thou, O God, which didst not go out with our armies. God will restore his saints. In any age, he is going to restore them. Though they be in trouble and difficulty and even sin, God is going to restore his saints, and he is going to restore his people. And that's a great promise that we have as well, that God is going to restore us. And one of my favorite professors in college used to say something along the lines of, I'm going to misquote it a little bit, but if the gospel's not about restoration, you can keep it. And that is a beautiful thing. It might have been about redemption, something like that, but restoration, redemption, more or less. So restoration, God will restore his saints. When we mess up, when we make mistakes, when we end up down in the dirt somewhere, when we're struggling, God will restore his saints. He promises that he's going to do that. And he did that for David, and he did that for his people, even though they were not very faithful to him. And then that brings us into Psalm 61. And this is kind of a new theme that we're going to see through Psalm 61 through 68. And this is a cry and confidence of the godly. As we read these passages, read these Psalms, listen to the pleadings of the godly in these 8 Psalms, and you'll find beautifully described their steadfast confidence in the Lord. You'll also see the Lord Jesus Christ in these Psalms, as well as derive great help for yourself. Psalm 61 is the chief musician upon Nagina, a psalm of David. And this is a psalm that you can play with a stringed instrument and would be appropriate for a guitar because of the mournful undertone. In verse 2, David says, from the ends of the earth will I call upon you when you pray. Have you ever felt God, that he's way up in the heavens and you are way down here? David feels that he is at the end of the earth and that God is way off yonder. He's trying to get closer. He wants to get to a rock that is higher than he is. And so he cries out to God. And I think that's one of the beautiful things that we see in David in all of the Psalms. And when we see David's writings, we see that he longs to be close to God. And how many of us can honestly say that we really long to be closer to God? I mean, some of us might say here and there that we want to, and I'm sure all of us have those passing moments where we realize that we're not as close as we should be, and we're like, God, I can do better. But then we don't do anything about it. That's not what David does. David realized that he didn't feel like he was close enough to God, so he cried out and he pled for God, and he asked for God to intervene and to come into his life. And so he wanted to feel God's presence. And we know that God will do that. He will make his presence known if we humble ourselves and come to him, just as David does here. And then that brings us into Psalm 62. In this one, David is going through a lot, and he's trusting completely in God. In fact, he's doing that because he knows that that is the only way that he can rest. He's trusting in the God of his salvation because he knows that he will protect him and give him rest. If you look in this psalm, we can see that David has complete confidence in God. We see it in verses 1 and 2, and then it continues in verses 5 through 8. David exhorts his soul that God alone is his defense and security. With God as his hope, David could not be shaken. David's kingdom was dependent on God. Without God's covering or protection, there would be no salvation for David. Therefore, he encouraged his fellow saints to pour out their hearts before him, as he was himself doing. Believers have every reason to trust God as their ever-present stronghold, just as David does. And that means me and you. David trusted in God And David referred to God constantly as his stronghold, as his place of strength, as the place where he went to get his power. And we have that same God. And so we can see in these Psalms that David has complete trust in God. And I think that is one of the main lessons that we can really learn from the whole book of Psalms. No matter what David went through, no matter where he was, no matter what he had done, or no matter what somebody else had done to him, he always trusted completely in his God. And really, we can do the same, and we should do the same, no matter what circumstances we face in this life. So that is all today from the book of Psalms. I will see you guys back here tomorrow in the book of Job.